I'd like to tell you about our presenter today, Harold Gates. He's the president and co-founder of the Midwest Center for Cultural Competence. And he's been consulting since 1989. Harold holds a master's degree in social work from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a master's in Chinese studies from Washington University at St. Louis. He also has a BA in Asian Studies from Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. Harold has worked as a school social worker and a university counselor, primarily with students of color. He's also taught human services courses at Madison College in Madison, Wisconsin, and has co-founded 3 community-based groups that support interracial families and their children. More recently, Harold has served as a cultural competence consultant, co-chairing the Cultural Competence Strategic Planning Committee in the Wisconsin Department of Health Services. He does advising on issues of culturally competent policy and service delivery. And now I'd like to turn the presentation over to Harold.
Thank you, Maureen. Cindy, can you hear me well?
I can hear you perfectly, Harold. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, and welcome everybody to the third and final webinar of the series, looking at how to sustain cultural competence in class. And so our learning objectives for today are helping you create a cultural and linguistic competence action plan, how to successfully move along the cultural competence continuum. I think it's one of the things that sometimes is overlooked in our whole process of just where am I in terms of my work and where is my organization in terms of the work we're doing. And lastly, how the class assessment tool can help change service delivery. And we'll walk through each of these tools as we do the webinar this morning. So on your screen you'll see, and you also have this, can access this in a file that Cindy has prepared for us, but we're looking at some things that will help you with your own specific action plan, because I think that's really something that's useful for each one of us to have some ideas in mind, but also do it in a systematic way and be able to gauge our progress and the challenges we have as we go about coming up with ways of working with diverse client populations. So initially, think about a population you serve for which you're committed to improving the quality of your service delivery. What would be an advantage to the population of your efforts? And what would be a personal motivation for improving the quality of service delivery? So that's on the first page of the action plan. As we move through to the second page, think about your physical environment at your organization or agency or where you do your work on a regular basis. What does it look like? What kind of materials or resources do you have that help reflect the demographics of your customers, your clients, your consumers? Next, please describe ways you might strengthen communication styles with the population you identified. So think about, again, the demographics of the customers or consumers that you serve. Which one would you like to focus on, and how would you break it down accordingly? So how might you strengthen your communication styles with the population? What about your own beliefs, values, and attitudes that you'd like to take a look at and pick one that you specifically want to work on? The next one is please identify one thing you still need to learn about engagement, trust, and relationship building with your population of interest. So we're getting now into the clinical therapeutic counseling mode and how we engage with clients initially. So engagement, trust, and relationship building. What are some things one thing at least that you could work on to continue to improve in that area? The next page we look at, think of one thing you still need to learn about assessment and problem definition with that particular population. So looking at assessment, problem definition, what specific thing would you like to work on? Next, please describe one thing you still need to work on about contracting and goal setting with your population of interest. So again, what would you want to know more about contracting with the specific clientele, specific population that you work with that you want to continue to improve on? The next area would be, please describe one thing you still need to learn about development of interventions. So we're looking at the whole process again and breaking it down about how we engage and work with our clients. Next, please describe one thing you still need to learn about evaluation of success and failure with your population of interest. So what would success look like? What would failure look like? And lastly, describe one thing you still need to learn about termination with your population of interest. So again, it's thinking about the population that you want to become more effective with or learn more about, and break it down into terms of what does your organizational environment look like, also what does your therapeutic process and approach look like. So with that in mind, let's do a little reflection. So think about, and you can chime in on this now in your chat. How can you use the information from the action plan in your counseling practice? So let's just look at that for a moment and let me know what you're thinking. So how can you use the information from the action plan in your counseling practice?
Go ahead and type in the chat feature what you're thinking about, and we'll give it a few minutes. While you're thinking about what Harold Gates was just talking about and letting us know, I just want to remind you that there is a link in the very bottom feature that you can navigate to get to the first two recordings in this series. And yay, we see some answers coming in. Thanks.
So I see a few comments coming in, and I'll just try to pick a few as they scroll by. A simple conversation could lead to additional training and educational opportunities. We have business meetings once a month, and we can identify cultures that we might not have resources for, and then identify a plan to obtain resources for that culture. So good points in terms of organizationally, how you might begin to identify and also work on some of these things. Creating a safe and inclusive environment where all members of our population feel welcome, that's definitely a critical piece. Learning how to better meet people where they're at and be more effective in helping. That's one of those things we talk about all the time, but how well do we do it, or how much do we actually evaluate if we start where the client is? That's a nice saying, but what are we really doing about that? And how do we make space and people feel welcome when they come to your organization or your agency? That seems to be a piece that is recurring, creating a safe space for people to feel welcome. Some people have a committee where one of their focuses on cultural humility, and I'll talk about that briefly, especially focus on LGBTQ individuals, focusing also on generational issues and language barriers. Intentionally pursue a diverse workforce, which also could help with some of the challenges around looking at different populations. Who's in your community? Who do you serve on a regular basis? Or who might be new populations coming in that you don't know much about, but you most likely need to know something about them. The action plan could serve as a blueprint for present and future policies and regulations regarding cultural and linguistic responsiveness and sensitivity. Excellent. And that's one of the things I encourage is, when I talk about assessment tools, it's something that hopefully you'll take to heart and use for yourself, because everybody has different areas that we either have strengths in or challenges in. So how do I make this individualized? And it's something that you only have to share with yourself. Look at what training is available and the frequency for staff and clients. Be open to the conversation. Getting comfortable with what is sometimes uncomfortable, and that's so true. A lot of times I find the biggest challenge around this work is where am I and how do I manage my anxiety around it. And in the first webinar, I talked about things like empathy and self-compassion. If we can be empathic towards the people we're working with and even colleagues, and when we're being challenged, don't be so hard on yourself, but do challenge yourself to continue to improve. That should be part of our professional ethical standards. Let me ask the other question. So a lot of good feedback on this initial one. And I see someone mentioned do a walkthrough of your organization, which would help you get more out of the clouds and into the actual world that you work and live in. So the next question on reflection is, what would incorporating cultural competence in your practice look like? So more specifically, what would that look like, in your opinion, in your particular organization? Someone mentioned some of the things they're working on, getting more culturally sensitive posters and pictures posted throughout our agency, and that's one of the things I'll talk about shortly when we look at the continuum and some other things as we get more into the webinar. Making it a part of all grant-making announcements and award decisions. Excellent. That's a piece of community engagement, community relationships. Know the background of your populations and be able to direct them to needed services. And hopefully we're continuing to learn about the services that are out there, because they're community-based services that sometimes we don't know about and are that we know about and can refer people to them because they don't know about them. Attempting to get more individuals to buy into the change that is needed through literature education. Taking a look at barriers that clients face and not making assumptions, listening to their concerns. Oh, that's certainly a novel concept, huh? Like we could actually hear what the folks who are coming to us have to say and give them some credit for knowing how they live their lives. Print materials in different languages, multicultural staffing within the agency on board of directors. I think some of you are looking ahead to my future slides here. But that's good, because those are good comments and good ideas. So organizationally, again, we're looking at what can you do as a practitioner, administrator, provider, and then what can your organization do? Those are the two pieces of this whole webinar series, is what am I doing and what is my organization doing to move us up the continuum. So I think we'll stop there and appreciate your feedback and comments, and hopefully we can record those and be able to take a look at them later. So let's move on. If you're finishing up something, go ahead, but we're going to move on now to the next section of the webinar, which is about looking at what is a culturally competent organization. So a culturally competent program is one that demonstrates understanding of and responsiveness to cultural differences in program design, implementation, and evaluation or reflection on what it is that you're attempting to do, what have you been successful at, and what's still a challenge for your organization. So let's look again at the continuum of cultural competence, because I think this is the piece that sometimes we forget about when we're trying to manage all of this. So we go from cultural destructiveness to cultural proficiency. So what's cultural destructiveness? Well, that's looking at cultures, seeing them as a problem or a threat, not engaging in ways that value difference in people. So some examples might be, and we can relate to some of these historically and some of these currently, removing children from their families on the basis of culture. That's something that certainly happened historically and is currently happening. Risking the well-being of minority individuals by involving them in social or medical experiments without their knowledge of consent, and that's happened. You know, there's a book actually called Medical Apartheid, and it looks at how various populations in this country have been treated in really not so good ways around medical procedures and other things as well. Cultural incapacity is the lack of ability to help cultures from diverse communities, and assuming a paternalistic posture towards lesser groups. So what are some examples of that? Maintaining stereotypes, for example, discriminatory employment practices, inability to match services with authentic needs of the diverse client populations, cultural denial or blindness, a belief that color or culture makes no difference and that all people are the same. That's something that, you know, has been talked about off and on. Our viewing ourselves as unbiased and believe that we already address people's cultural needs. So what are some examples of cultural denial? I treat everybody alike. We're beyond culture, language, race, gender, ability, class. Anything I got is because it's a level playing field, and all results are based on merit. So everybody has the same opportunities, and nothing goes wrong with that. So as we move up the continuum to cultural pre-competence, we're starting to recognize that there are some weaknesses in our attempts to serve various cultures. Some efforts are made to improve the services offered to diverse populations. So those are just some of the things that people attempt to do, and examples are engage diverse cultures in staff, leadership, and do basic cultural competence training. Sometimes we hire one or more workers from a racial or ethnic group and feel that you've done all that's necessary to make your place a more diverse environment. Potlucks are good, but, you know, sometimes they can be kind of superficial. Celebrating is good, but how about doing something a little bit more substantial? So as we look at cultural competence, it's defining success in terms of equity and access, quality and outcomes, and being reflective about process or outcomes related to cultural competence. Looking at everything you do through a lens of cultural competence. So what's some examples? Participating in continuing self-assessment and client, customer, patient assessment. So one of the things that's good is to do an assessment of where your organization is along the continuum. What do you think things are and we'll break that down shortly into about 4 components. So looking at your physical and social environment and having it be welcoming. Performance is measured based on cultural competence. And then we do our best to support staff members' comfort levels when working in cross-cultural situations. One of the things I always encourage is having a committee or at least a place to go for people to talk about some critical issues and things that cause people anxiety and around cultural competence. So finally, we're at the end point of the continuum, that's proficiency. So then you hold diversity of culture in high esteem. You seek to add to the knowledge base of culturally responsive practices. Your leadership reflects a commitment to cultural and linguistic proficiency. So what are some examples? You hire, retain, and develop staff members who are specialists in culturally competent practice. Your budgets, you budget around culture, because it's one thing to talk about it, but what resources are you carving out so that you can actually make those things happen? Work plans and strategic goals focus on expanding cultural responsiveness. And again, your leadership reflects a commitment to cultural and linguistic proficiency. So that's an overview of cultural competence continuum. And so let's break that down and look at some more specific pieces. So as you move along the continuum, progress doesn't just happen by chance. Change agents are valuable, and change teams are even more so, and I'll talk about that a little bit more towards the end of the webinar, because I think that's going to be a critical piece. How do you look at things pre-crisis? Because a lot of times we decide, oh, wow, we need to deal with this issue that came up because, you know, we have people complaining or concerned, or they're not feeling like they're getting their needs met. Well, if we had some plans in place before that, then we'd be more likely to have better outcomes and to do it in a more culturally competent way. So this should be integrated into philosophy of the agency or organization, policies, day-to-day practices. That will make it easier to sustain in the long haul. Things like hiring practices, service delivery, community outreach must all include the principles of cultural competence. A behavioral response to cultural difference and diversities, a critical component of moving yourself along. We're always inevitably responding to culture and difference. It doesn't matter if the person looks like me or not. We're all coming from different perspectives, and our culture informs our perspectives. Excuse me, identifying where we are on the continuum helps us move toward greater supporting and promoting of cultural competence. And our basic life position on the continuum represents our fundamental beliefs and values. So that's a way to check in with ourselves to see where we're at, and also organizationally, where is the organization at in terms of any interactions we have with difference. And we can move up and down the continuum at any point. I mean, so even though we're maybe at, say, cultural pre-competence or competence, sometimes we do things and we wonder, well, how did that happen? Or why did I do that? Well, we're still steeped in our cultures that we came from, so we have to unlearn some things in the process. The messages we send through service delivery, staff team development, organizational environments, and community relationships are 4 major components of breaking this down, breaking cultural competence down on an organizational level. So let's look at them specifically. So if we look at service delivery, what about in terms of working with consumers, clients, or patient focus, what about access? How do people actually get to our services? What kind of meaningful involvement do they have in decisions that are made about their treatment or service delivery? Are we family friendly? And what does family mean? Do we know, again, the demographics of people that we serve? Who do they consider family? Outreach services that increase access. So if people are going to get to us, how are we reaching out to them? Are we going to their community? do we have any grievance process? Because a lot of times people sometimes vote with their feet, or they feel like they're not getting what they need. So do we have a process in place that makes that happen? And when they come in the door, do they get greeted in a way that makes them feel welcome, or do they get put off and decide to leave? So culturally competent reception services. And there are actually things on the Georgetown National Center for Cultural Competence website that relates to community brokering and that kind of thing. So I would encourage you to check that out. And the price is right on there. Access to materials, it's free. So it's definitely worth checking out. So service delivery in terms of documentation. So when we're recruiting people or putting out PR materials, or enrolling them in programs and services that we offer, or coming up with direct service materials, how are we considering, again, the demographics of people we're working with? And does it need to be in a different language? Are people visually impaired, or have deaf and hard of hearing clientele? You know, how do we actually put those materials together, and are we doing that already, or are we being challenged to do that? Quality assurance, so how are we checking to make sure that what we're doing is working or not? Is it decentralized so that various units and teams can actually do this? What kind of representation do we have on those committees or teams that can help us actually do that? How are we developing leadership to look at and measure our progress or lack thereof? And what kind of cross-cultural collaboration are we using? And do we have any resources for that? Because that tends to be a challenge from time to time. Looking at recruitment more specifically, what's our selection criteria? Who are we looking at? Who do we want to get on board? And how do we actually do that? How do we go about our hiring process? And is our hiring process a barrier to us getting the kind of workforce that we want to have? Do we take into account people bring in things like language skills and other cultural skills that can be of use for our agency, our clientele? And do we actually carve that out? And how do we know that they're doing a good job? What about looking at compensation and benefits? What's the pay structure like? Are certain people grouped into a certain pay category, or can we make that more equitable? What kind of compensation do people get besides like a comp day off? Do they get pay or some kind of incentive to help them? And how do we check people's progress? I think one of the overlooked pieces of cultural competence from an organizational and an individual professional level is performance appraisals. And who wants to do those, right? Not many people, but one of the things that can be useful is for you to pick out, like on your action plan, something that you're going to work on for the next 6 months to a year, and have that be something that you can have as a part of your performance appraisal, and also encourage management to give you some resources to make that happen. And I know that's a challenge, but it's also something that if they are having it as a major value in your organization, then that could be one way that you show that you've accomplished something, and or show that you weren't able to accomplish it because you didn't have the resources or time in order to complete your task. Personnel policies, do they reflect cultural competence? So some ways to develop and retain a staff and workforce is, do you have mentoring support for people as they come in? Do they feel empowered to do the work that they're tasked to do? What kind of training opportunities are there, and especially around this topic, cultural competence, excuse me, what kind of conflict resolution process is available? Because you know there's always issues that come up in every workplace, and some people, some organizations do that better than others. What about supervision around cultural issues? Do you have that weekly supervision meeting, and or do you need to have one that's more specifically looking at cultural competence? And I refer back to the second webinar where we took a more practical, in-depth look at how you practically apply cultural competence in your therapeutic process. What are you doing with those kinds of things, and what is it that you might be challenged with so that you can be more specific when you talk about this in supervision sessions? What kind of barriers need to be removed for you to retain and develop workforce, the people at your organization, and how do you support success? What kind of awards, what kind of recognition do people get for a good job done? The organizational environment. That's the other section we're looking at, is how do people access your organization, your building? Is it ADA compliant? And if it's not, what do you do about that? Do people feel welcome? Do they see things that reflect their culture and background when they come to the actual building and site? Is signage up that either directs people to where to go, or that helps people who are visually impaired figure out where they're going? What about the use of equipment? Do we have seating and other things in place that people can use and feel comfortable in? Is that something that we do? The scale of your furniture, for example. What about barriers or entryways? Cleanliness? Does our place look pretty decent when people come in here, or do they get put off by that? I mean, these are just some specific things that you could be taking a look at in your physical environment. Communication, so language. Do we have signage up in the language of various populations that we serve? What's our vision and values as an organization? A lot of times I think these are really important components, because if you're doing things, you should know why you're doing them and what your organization values and what you actually do. Are there clear lines of communication? In most workplaces, organizations, there are formal and informal rules. Do people know what those are, or do people kind of get caught up or tripped up by that process? What kind of shared language is being used in the organization? Is management and staff both tuned into interactions that they have and how people are able to manage those? And do you have clear conflict resolution strategies for when things come up? Just some things to think about in terms of communication. So let's look at it all together. Leadership, is your board of directors diverse, or at least represent the demographics of the clients you serve? What about management? A lot of times we have diversity in terms of gender, but not necessarily in terms of ethnic or racial background. What about the diversity of the staff? And how inclusive do you feel the organizational structure is where you do your work on a day-to-day basis? So the last piece is community relationships and your visibility. What about in public relations and media? How good at you are at doing that, and what do you have in place in your organization to make that happen in a culturally competent way? What kind of social presence? Do people even know who you are? And where do you go or show up when things are happening in the community? Professional development. Do you either send your staff and or have people come into your organization to learn some things that you have to offer? And that could be looking at it in terms of just routine trainings or workshops to things that include CEUs and other things that might be attractive for people to come and share in your knowledge and your expertise. Outreach and education about public policy. One of the things that is in the proficiency area of cultural competence is how you're an advocate for cultural competence in your own community or among other organizations that you work with. Or are you a best kept secret? How do you actually be an advocate for this. And it's a challenge because everybody's sort of at different places along the continuum, but are you tuned into at least getting that word out so that people actually know what you do? Community engagement. So how do you engage with your community? What about participant client advocacy? And do you actually pull in cultural brokers, people that can actually help you be more engaged with your community because they know what's going on and they want to share that with you, and you're open to taking that knowledge in and providing better service delivery? What about community alliances that you have? And are you a role model of cultural competence with the people in your community? Are you doing your best to at least attempt that? Fund development. So a lot of times when we talk about resources, what's going on in terms of building relationships, because people tend to give money or at least support causes that are based on relationships, especially a lot of the ethnic and racial groups that are not part of the mainstream necessarily. Grant writing, is it included in that? And I know a lot of the federal agencies now are asking you, what are you doing around cultural and linguistically appropriate services as part of your grant writing process? So what are you saying, and how much can you talk about that collaborative endeavors and donor development? How are you reaching out and developing sources of income or funding support in the diverse communities? Those are things to keep in mind as we look at community relationships. So what are the characteristics of culturally competent agencies? As you see, acceptance and respect for cultural differences is important. Careful attention paid to dynamics of difference, and that's always there. It doesn't matter what people look like, what particular demographic they represent. There's always difference going on, and how much attention are we paying to that? Do you do a cultural self-assessment either individually? And one of the first tools in the first webinar was a cultural competence self-test that you could kind of see where you were in terms of your levels of cultural competence. Cultural groups are viewed as being different, and different is not bad, it just is. So what difference are we dealing with, and how do we manage that? And then attention being paid to hiring culturally diverse and competent workers. So those are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but they don't always go hand in hand either. So who's representing some of our clientele, and who's also pretty good and proficient in cultural competence? So looking at some more characteristics of an agency that is really tuned into cultural competence, we have clear expectations, and that means we tell people what we're capable of providing, so they're not misinformed or they're not wondering why we didn't serve their needs. Well, if that's not in our mission, vision, and values, we need to let people know that so that they can make informed decisions. Continuous expansion of knowledge, resources, and adaptations to service programs. Your organization should provide support to staff in their efforts to increase their competence, and policies that support and drive the effort. That's going to help people systemically have a sense of what we're doing and why we're doing this. So how do we put it into practice? Look at service delivery, staff team development, our HR kinds of things, environmental, organizational environment, what do we look like, what's our mission, vision, values, what does our board of directors look like, management, etc. And then community relationships, what kind of relationships do we have with our people that we actually work with on a regular, routine basis. So let's take a look at a useful tool that I think will help us kind of pull a lot of this together. one of the things that I would encourage you to be looking at on a regular basis is the class assessment tool. And this comes from the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, their Office of Health Equity, and it helps break down the class standards into some of the major components. And again, you'll have access to this form on the website. But the first, it breaks down the national class standards into three major areas: culturally competent leadership and workforce, and it looks at some specific standards that relate to that. Language access and communication, which a lot of times some of the particular standards are ones we should already be doing because they're federally mandated, like timely professional interpreting services, looking at folks who are deaf or hard of hearing and how do we give them access to what we have available for them. And then the last section that the assessment tool looks at is the organizational support and accountability. So looking at what kind of plan you have in place, how do you review what your plan is doing in terms of the class standards. And at the bottom of this particular tool, on the next page at the bottom, there's a work plan. So if you looked at all these standards and see which ones are you the ones you're doing successfully, or more specifically, which one would you like to work on as part of an organizational action plan, you can select one or more of the questions above and then briefly describe what you would do to improve your class efforts this year. So this, again, gives you a tool actually that you can take a look at that will help you not have to wonder what the standards are, even though, again, we have them as documents you can download so you have them at your disposal. But take a serious look at one or two of these and what do you want to do to make change happen around those organizational. So one of the pieces that I've looked at over time, and that's a really major part of the NIATEX model, and I'll talk more about that shortly, but it's plan, do, study cycles. Plan, do, study, act cycles. And this is a way of, if you picked a particular class standard to actually implement or work on, then you could do a brief look at it in some time frame and plan, do, study, and act on it and see if it's even worth adopting, or not even doing at all by using this process. And a lot of this information, again, will be available to you if you are not already familiar with it on niatex.net. You can check that out because a lot of these documents and things I'm referring to are on the website for your use. So again, thinking about one of the specific class standards that you want to act on, then you can take it through a PDSA cycle. And I'm not necessarily going in the order that NIATEX does, but just highlighting some of the things I think are really useful for you. But if you look at the website, you'll see that there's some specific order to how to go through a process improvement and work on this. This is something that I've put together that is useful for breaking down your action plan and the power to serve. Is looking at, again, service delivery, staff team development, organizational environment or structure, and community partnerships. So what's our aim? What's our desired outcome? What tasks do we need to make happen in order for this to become a viable option or something that we actually can measure? Who's the responsible party? And so that we're not looking around 6 months to a year later wondering, well, I thought you were working on that. No, I thought you were working on that. No, someone is responsible for it, and this is the person who's responsible. And it could be the change team leader or your executive sponsor. And again, those are NIATEX components that I think will be useful to you. Resources in hand needed. So do we need money, budgets for this, or do we need to carve out time for this? What is it that we need so that we can make this happen? How will the team know if the aim is achieved? And so again, the NIATEX model is great for helping you look at those kinds of things. And then what's your timeline or benchmarks? Will we see this happen in 6 months, or will it be something we work on for the next year or two? So the NIATEX process improvement looks at, for example, just a quick overview. What's the class implementation we want to make? How do we integrate it into our process improvement work? Some of the class standards might work more easily with using PDSA cycles than others, and what kind of evaluation will you do? And one of the sources I took some of this from is the Wisconsin Department of Health Services. Their minority health program had actually a few years ago done some work on this and had presented a webinar for NIATEX on this very topic and how to actually implement class by using the process. So one example might be looking at accessibility and treatment. So what class standard relates to that?
Not sure what happened there. Let me get back to the slide. Sorry.
Okay, it came back up. Thank you. Doing a walkthrough, what does that look like from the customer's perspective if they came into our organization and they needed some language services or access to be able to get into the building? What would that look like? How would we actually make that happen? So then what's your project aim, and then doing a PDSA cycle, and then how would you sustain that improvement that you want to make? So again, a quick and brief look at that. One of the things I thought was really useful from having been a part of a Change Leader Academy recently is the nominal group technique, and it can help you look more specifically at the class standards by doing some what would in other terms be called brainstorming. So let's look at that briefly. What do you do well related to class, to culturally and linguistically appropriate services? Number two, what could we do better as it relates to class standards and services? And three, what would we like to change in how we train for and implement culturally and linguistically appropriate services? What change would we like to actually try out? What do we need to do to work on our most recent class goals? So these are some main questions you could ask yourself, and this diagram kind of helps you walk through the process if you're using the nominal group process. And that, you pull together your materials and welcome folks to the process, and then you begin to have people think about silently some ideas that might help you with dealing with the particular class standard you want to see happen. Doing a round robin to get people's ideas one at a time so that they can talk about and put those out there. And this is, putting these on a flip chart using stick post-it notes and that kind of thing. So it's a really good process of helping you walk through things and getting people's ideas and having them give you a little bit more information about that idea, doing your discussion of the ideas. And then lastly, prioritization. You can't do everything, so how do you narrow down what you're going to actually do to make this happen in some meaningful way so that you can actually come up with one or two ways of going about your action. So, kind of going through things, and we're running down on time here, a lot of material that tried to squeeze into the hour. So do you have any questions or comments based on everything we've tried to cover? And then we also have the references that you can check out, resources for some of the tools and things that I mentioned, the class standards, the cultural community engagement pyramid, the class assessment tool, and then the action plan you have that was put together by the center. Did we also want to mention the poll again, Cindy or Maureen? Anything as we're winding down before people ask some questions?
Hi, Harold. This is Cindy. Yes, we can do that. I want to stay on this page for just a second so folks know that those links, they're live and clickable right now on the actual PowerPoint slides. Also, if you download the slides, all those links are available for you. We've added a few links on the bottom right as well. So lots of information going on there. And I'm going to go ahead and scoot to a question and answer layout, but we'll make sure that all these links are available, okay? And I think Maureen's got questions for you to, I can't talk, sorry. Maureen's got questions from the group for you, Harold, and please keep them coming in. We still have a few minutes.
Okay.
Very good. Thanks so much, Cindy. And thanks, Harold.
You're
Our
welcome.
first question is from Margaret Williams asking about staff struggles to change and adjust or learn cultural competence. How can a company as a whole implement staff awareness?
That's a good global question. So I would think back to, I mentioned earlier, doing an assessment so that you have a better sense of what it is that most staff are having questions or concerns about. So I'm not sure how you do that in your own organization now, but that would be one way to sort of put out a survey or somehow ask people and see what the majority of people are struggling with or concerned about, and then look at this through some of the processes that I was talking about earlier, like how would you actually do some change around that? The one thing I found really useful is NIATEX on a napkin, so that you can look at this 5-minute video that helps you start to think about, well, okay, well, most people say they want to do something around language access because we don't know how to use the language access line, or we don't have many people that can interpret the language without having to go through a lot of changes to make that happen. So if that's a major concern, and who are the people that you need to have involved with that, what kind of tools and resources do you need to have to make this happen? And a subset of that is having a committee or a work group actually start to pull this together, because things tend to come up all the time, but where do people go with that? That's a real big challenge. And then lastly, having some rules that you use in order to kind of keep the process focused and to see what's useful and what isn't. So that's a kind of a global answer to your question, but I think it's finding out what most people want and then having a group that can process that and look at some kind of change mechanism that will help this happen in your organization.
Thanks, Harold. And thanks for referring people to NIATEX. One thing that the NIATEX process encourages is for people to start with something small, making a small change and seeing if it's effective, rather than trying to do something big that might be overwhelming. And what you mentioned in your presentation was checking how welcoming is your environment. A lot of change projects start with just that. What's it like for a customer to experience coming to your organization? And just from that, you might get some ideas on what you could do to make changes that reflect cultural competence.
Excellent points. I think starting simple is great, and also trying to stay focused is a great thing as well.
And this leads to the next question from Dawn Todd. Can an organization really be proficient or always trying to be committed to this cultural competence?
That's a good question. So this takes me back to cultural humility and cultural competence. Um, it's a challenge to, nobody's perfect, okay? I mean, proficiency is like the end point in terms of like perfection. Nobody's perfect, but we can strive to do a better job than we're doing. So trying to do our best not to get caught up in terms, but actually seeing what's going on. So what would help us do a better job, I think maybe is another way to look at that, so that we're not constantly thinking we're not making any progress. But if we carve out something small to work on, we can see how much more improvement we can make, and we can strive to be more proficient. So that shouldn't stop us from doing something, but it's probably something we'll always be continuing to work on, and it's a continuous improvement kind of process. So that's how I see it. It's a challenge to be proficient, but doesn't mean that we can't carve out something that we know we could do a better job at, and to actually measure that.
Thanks, Harold. Our next question. Do you know of any funding source that supports capacity building for class?
Wow, that's a good question. I don't right off the top of my head. Do you have any thoughts about that, Maureen?
I'm not aware of any that exist right now, but we can certainly explore that and make that information available if something does become available.
Yeah, and I'm thinking that in the not too distant future, there might be more made available, because there's more encouragement and push to have people adhere to the standards, so not everybody has the resources to make it happen.
That's true. And our next question I'm sorry, I didn't get the name of this person. We seem to have some of the building blocks in place: a committee, bilingual staff, bicultural staff, and putting forms in different formats, Braille or American Sign Language. We need the next step of how to sustain this. The interest and motivation was high in the beginning, but 2 years into the process, our committee is not meeting because of lack of motivation, despite the leadership giving verbal support.
Wow. So since I'm obviously not familiar with what you've done before, and if you haven't used some kind of change or process improvement model like Six Sigma or some of the others, or Covey or whatever, I would say look at NIATEX on a napkin to help you restart your efforts, because it's exactly those kinds of things that happen in the long haul. How do you actually make sure that you keep this going, rather than it's a flash in the pan and it happened one day and the next day it's gone, especially if you have clientele that actually continue to need the service that you were wanting to provide. I know that our time is winding down too, so Cindy and Maureen, are we at a stopping point, or do we need to go a little long?
We have time for one or two more questions, Harold.
Okay.
And let me cut in, Maureen, and I'm sorry if those of you that have to leave, because this was a 1-hour webinar, we will have the recording available, so you're not going to miss anything by missing these last few questions. Thanks. Go ahead.
One of our participants asked if there's any training to be eligible for providing translation depending on the language.
Oh, wow. There is a national group that trains, and it's an association for people who do interpreting and translation. I'm not remembering the correct name of it now, but we could get that information and get back to you later on that, or post it at a later date, Maureen.
Yes, we can definitely do that. There's actually more than one organization, and we can add that as a resource when we post your webinar recording, Harold.
Oh, I agree. We have one of the national experts here in town at the university hospitals, the diversity officer there, And as you said, there's more than one, so these would probably be good resources.
Yes, thanks. And our last question, participant asked about resources available for this topic to be brought to an agency to educate facilities. And I would say many of the resources that you've presented in this webinar are a starting point.
Exactly. So more specifically, again, what was the question, Maureen?
Are there resources available for this topic to be brought into an agency to educate facilities? And that looks like will have to be our last question for today.
Yeah, and you know, the Think Cultural Health website that the Department of Health and Human Services on the national level has would be one place to start for looking at things online. And then Culture Care Connections in Minneapolis is another really good website to look at, where you can actually walk through implementing the class standards and look at various webinars related to particular client populations. A lot of it's geared to Minnesota residents, but the overall class information is anything that anybody can do, and there's quizzes and newsletters and lots of other good stuff there.
Thanks, Harold.
You're welcome.
We can also add that to our list of resources. And Cindy, I think it's the top of the hour and time for us to sign off.
Okay, huge thank you to our presenter, Harold Gates, for this and all three webinars, actually. I'm sure you can see from the comments that folks are very appreciative